Good afternoon, everybody. That's a little loud. We're going to go ahead and begin this debate by introducing our wonderful judge panel, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Let me first start by introducing one of our judges, Victoria Baker. She's from Arkansas. She's a homeschooling mom of 4 and is the club coordinator for AROS. Kimberly Farley is from Tennessee. She's also a homeschool mom and a pediatric occupational therapist. She presents numerous times for community groups and training conferences for teachers about child development. Her son also competes in LD and her daughter is here in speech. Mark Russell is the STOA president, serves on the board. He's a homeschool dad, has been involved with this generic league for 15 years. He has 3 children who competed in TP, and he's judged at all levels throughout the United States. JC Overstreet is a graduate of University of Missouri School of Journalism. She's currently the Director of Communications for Lebanon, Missouri School District. Former STOA competitor and her team policy partner was Josh Long, also on our judging panel. He is a graduate of Ole Miss Law and is currently studying to take the bar. Jake Seward is another former competitor who's judging today. He competed from 2005 to 2009 and came to NCSCA Nationals in TP, Extemp, and Impromptu. He is currently working at JP Morgan, advising clients on investments and market conditions, and plans to move to San Francisco to work for an equity firm. Bill Foreman is from here in Missouri. He has been retired for 15 years, but formerly worked as a manufacturer's representative. He currently teaches Bible studies 2 nights a week and has judged for the last 2 years. Heather Walters is the Assistant Director of Debate at Missouri State University and Director of Debate at Greenwood Live School. She's also the Chair of Ozark District of the NSCA. She has a Master's degree in Communication from Missouri State University and a JD from the University of Maryland Law School. And finally, Dr. Charles DeBerry. He was a team policy debater in college and coached team policy debate at the collegiate level for 10 years and is currently the director of the debate union here at Drury University. He received his PhD from the University of Kansas. Let's give our judges a hand.
My name is Justin Holman, your first attorney. My name is Justin Holman, your first attorney. Justin Holman, my name is Ryan. My name is Ryan. Jake Johnson, sorry. Jake Johnson, your second name.
And before we start, I just want to make sure that you guys all give our final 2 team policy teams a round of applause.
All right, then all the judges are ready. Wow, then let's begin. The hospital is one of the places where we are most vulnerable. We implicitly trust that the medicine we are handed will make us better. Unfortunately, that hope is misguided. Due to a legal loophole, Chinese chemical companies are able to export medicinal ingredients with no regulations because they are not registered as pharmaceutical companies. This was the reason that Wang Weiping, a Chinese tailor with a 9th grade education and a chemistry book, began to create unregulated medicinal ingredients. He used industrial grade syrup, not approved for human consumption, and forged his laboratory analysis reports. His brother stated he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't understand chemicals. Because there was a serious problem with unregulated chemical companies in China, my partner and I stand resolved. The United States federal government should substantially reform its trade policy with one or more of the following nations: China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Trade policy being defined here as laws related to the exchange of goods or services involving international trade, including taxes, subsidies, and import-export regulations. I'd also like to define API, or active pharmaceutical ingredient. And that is any substance or mixture of substances intended to be used in the manufacture of a drug or medicinal product, and that, when using the product of the drug, becomes an active ingredient of that drug product. In addition, we have proposed a criterion of net benefits in order to promote equity in the debate round. This means that in order for the negative team to win the debate round, they must show that the impacts of the status quo outweigh the impacts of our plan. Furthermore, to provide a brief summary of the present situation, we offer the following background points. The first is of lax chemical regulations. Lax chemical regulations. Professor Jeremy Hack, writing in July of 2015, said that, quote, really, the trouble starts with a gaping loophole in Chinese law. Chemical suppliers that are not qualified to make pharmaceutical-grade products often produce medicines anyway, but are not regulated by the Chinese Food and Drug Administration, or CFDA. Now, the second background point is of massive manufacturing sector. Massive manufacturing sector. The Mumbai Bureau of Pharmacists.com in June of 2014 said that in 2012, there were over 1,500 API manufacturers in China. Only about 250 have registered their products with internationally recognized agencies like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. API production facilities still have serious quality problems. Investigations by independent audit firms have uncovered misrepresentation or fraud at hundreds of API manufacturing facilities in China. Poor quality and safety are major concerns. Many locally manufactured APIs are made from unregulated bulk chemicals, some of which are not pharmaceutical grade. Now, to fix this problem, we propose the following plan. The United States federal government will pass legislation banning the import of APIs from Chinese chemical companies. Or read that. The United States federal government will pass legislation banning the import of APIs from Chinese chemical companies. Now, the agency will be Congress and the President, and the enforcement will be the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, U.S. Department of Commerce, and any other necessary bodies of the federal government. Our plan will phase in over 3 months, and no funding is necessary. Now, with our course of action clearly defined, let's look at the major reasons why America needs to prohibit imports from Chinese chemical companies through our advantages. Each advantage can be split into 3 parts, with the first looking at the current problem, the second, how we solve the problem, and finally, what it means for America and the world. So advantage 1 is of lives saved. Lives saved. Subpoint A is the problem. Dangerous chemical products. Dangerous chemical products. Dr. Roger Bate, writing for Real Clear Markets in May of 2011, said that Cynthia Riley, a director of the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, think we are already at greater risk every day because the chemicals coming from China. Not from lethal products, but because quality is lower, causing far more product recalls and hence drug stockouts. Now, subpoint B is our solvents here, how we solve that problem. U.S. jumpstarts protection. U.S. jumpstarts protection. Alexandra Osala, writing for Newsweek in September of 2015, said that it's an elegant solution to a very complex problem. If citizens force the United States to play a larger role in the international conversation about falsified drugs, the drug supply would be safer within U.S. borders, but also extend far beyond. With the pressure on, countries would likely band together to share detection technologies, collaborate on a universal database of legitimate pharmaceuticals, and pass international standards with real consequences. And that could quell rampant drug-resistant malaria in Laos, or save the lives of thousands of Sudanese citizens who thought they were safe because they got the meningitis vaccine, but really were injected with little more than safety. So not only will the action of the United States protect our industries, but it will provide a platform for worldwide discussion and increased regulation of this gaping loophole in The subpoint C is the impact, or what this means. Safer American medicine. Safer American medicine. Dr. Roger Bate, Lauren Mooney, and Jalissa Milligan, writing for the American Enterprise Institute in July 2011, said that the recent scarcity of life-saving drugs in U.S. hospitals and clinics supports this theory. The number of incidents between 2006 and 2010 tripled to a record 211 cases. In the first quarter of 2011, 89 incidents were reported. API importers must be more alert to the possibility of quality variation and aware of its sources, since even perfectly formulated products may be lethal if the API is suspect. This loop will be closed in order to preserve the sanctity of American medicine. As long as this persists, there is no way to have peace of mind when consuming any type of pharmaceutical product. But the second advantage is of increased economic competitiveness. Increased economic competitiveness. Subpoint A is the problem. Economic devastation. Economic devastation. Jonathan Carr, writing for Product Liability Monitor in June 2011, said that Illinois Circuit Court jury ordered Baxter International Inc. and Scientific Protein Laboratories to pay $625,000 to the estate of Stephen Johansson, who was given tainted doses of the blood thinner heparin, causing his death at age 63. The contaminated heparin has been linked to 81 deaths and 785 severe allergic reactions. So in the long run, any cost advantage of cheaper drugs is obliterated by the hundreds of lawsuits from selling faulty products. And this cannot be remedied until China's chemical industries are banned from selling APIs in the United States. Now we solve this problem in subpoint B. Quality of products ensured. Quality of products ensured. Dan Levin, writing for the New York Times in June 2015, said that, quote, China likes to think they're in control of everything, said a United Nations official. But at the end of the day, they have an enormous chemical industry, and the state doesn't have the capacity to monitor and control. So what this means we see in subpoint C. Long-term U.S. viability. Long-term U.S. viability. Joshua Phillip, writing for the NITOC Times in December of 2014, said that while the U.S. company Baxter received hundreds of lawsuits, China's heparin exporters appear to have recovered quickly from the scandal. So the common perception is that prohibiting APIs for chemical industries will hurt American businesses by raising prices. The truth of the matter is it actually saves them financially. Chinese chemical manufacturers are able to quickly rebound from scandals, leaving devastated American companies in their wake. So in conclusion, the United States has unwittingly become exposed to one of the most serious threats. Faulty medicine distributed to those who are too ill to question it. As more and more distributors like Wang Ping arise in China, it is clear we cannot rely on China to spring into action. Instead, we must take matters into our own hands and protect innocent people. Thank you.
First of all, congratulations on making it to the final.
To you as well.
Thanks. Can I get a copy of your plan?
Absolutely.
And with regards to your plan, you are only banning imports from, or APIs from chemical companies coming from China, right?
Chinese chemical companies.
Okay, great. What is the percentage of the United States APIs coming from China? What's the percentage of our?
The overall percentage is 40%.
40%. So where's that other 60%?
Other distributors around the world, as well as some in the United States as well.
Okay, interesting. And with regards to your background point one, you talked about the last chemical regulation. You agreed this part argument was talking about specifically Chinese regulations, not U.S. federal regulations.
It's a legal loophole in China's law that allows them to make chemical APIs without having any instructions.
Okay.
So yes.
Are there any restrictions on importing APIs from China?
Are there any restrictions? Well, there's supposed to be good manufacturing practice. That's not what we're seeing.
But there's no restrictions from the federal restrictions.
There are quality restrictions, but again, they're not checking back and actually ensuring this is what they're actually keeping safe materials.
Interesting. And under your second background point, you talked about how there's a massive manufacturing sector. Okay, was this specific to chemical companies or drug companies that use APIs in their products?
It was talking about API manufacturers, and that evidence is only about 250 have been registered.
Okay, so what's the difference between an API manufacturing company and a chemical company?
Chemical companies manufacture APIs.
And under your timeline, you talked about how it's ultimately 3 months will be enacted. What is the United States production capacity for APIs?
Again, we actually can get APIs right now from Chinese pharmaceutical companies, which are regulated. Going to chemical companies.
But you are banning the import of APIs from China.
From Chinese chemical companies.
Okay, so what's the difference between a chemical company and a drug?
A chemical company has no regulation. Pharmaceutical companies in China have
So you brought up evidence about that?
correct.
And under your next point, you talked about the lives saved, and you talked about subpoint A, dangerous chemical products. Okay, what is the number of APIs that come into the United States outside of drugs?
What are the number of APIs?
Yeah.
Well, essentially what happens is U.S. companies buy bulk chemicals from these manufacturers in China and then assemble the drugs in the United States.
But the APIs can just be put into a drug and then sent to the United States, and that's not under your plan.
It's in the
If the APIs are put into drugs, but then the companies in China ship them to the United States, that's not banned.
We can only buy actually completed pharmaceuticals from Chinese pharmaceutical companies. That's why there's a loophole with the APIs.
And under your next point, you talk about U.S. jumpstart production. What is the number of people who have died as a result of Chinese APIs?
Well, specifically looking at the heparin scandal we talked about,
Heparin scandal. Was this specific to people just drinking heparin, or was it drugs that contain heparin?
they were drugs containing heparin. Baxter actually put these APIs from China.
So these were pharmaceutical drugs
That's what I mean.
that we bought from China that included heparin.
The API was part of the heparin that came directly from China.
Okay. Interesting. And under your next point, you talk about economic competitiveness. Can you quantify for me the economic benefit you'll be getting as a result of this plan?
We're specifically preventing companies from having to pay stockouts, write-offs, and actually hit lots of hundreds of lawsuits like Baxter.
Thanks.
Starting to make it. Minutes remaining. Two minutes and 30 seconds remaining. Two minutes remaining.
So in this first negative speech of the round, I'd like to start out with a negative philosophy. Basically something overall that we as the negative team will be looking at when addressing the affirmative team's case. And that'll be three things. First of all, we'll be taking a look at how the plan is unnecessary. How the affirmative team actually hasn't proven a need for their plan in the current system. Secondly, we'll take a look at how it is ineffective. How it will do nothing to make the United States safer, it will not solve for their advantages. And thirdly, we're going to go ahead and take a look at how it's disadvantageous, how it actually creates more harm than good in the real world. So before I get into any specific argumentation responding to their case, I want to present one burden for the affirmative team. And that burden is evidence of harm now. Evidence of harm now. Now, all of the affirmative team's evidence was referencing studies that were not very recent in the United States. So my 8-point under this is that 44 companies are banned. 44 companies banned, according to Zachary Brennan, writing for the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, April 8, 2016. There are now 44 Chinese companies on the list, which means that these companies' products are banned from entering the United States. This is very, very important because this is from April 8 of this year, talking about how 44 companies who sell these chemical products have been banned in the United States. And the affirmative team has brought up no evidence that there's actually a harm in the United States post April 8, 2016. The impact is burden of proof, not upheld. Burden of proof, not upheld. Now, the affirmative team has the burden to prove to you that there's a need to change our current system. They have the burden to prove that there's actually a problem in the current system. As of yet, they haven't proven that problem because there's obviously a lot of these companies that are already being banned in the current system. So the impact is that the plan is unnecessary. We don't need their plan until they've actually proven a need. They brought up all in their case that their criterion would be that of net benefits. I do want to clarify one thing. We agree that we should be looking at net benefits, but the affirmative team also has to uphold these stock issues of team policy debate. They have to prove that there's a problem in the current system, that's inherency. They have to prove that they can solve for that problem, that's solvency. They have to prove that there's a significant problem to be solved, and they have to prove that their case is under resolution. So they have to uphold those as well as the criterion of net benefit. So with that clarified, let's go ahead and take a look at their first background point of last chemical regulations. My first response to this is Chinese regulations. Chinese regulations. Now, what this evidence was actually talking about is there was a lack of Chinese regulations in the current system, not a lack of United States regulations. So they haven't actually proven a harm here in the current system because this was only talking about Chinese regulations, not actual United States import regulations of these API drugs. And my second response to this is US government requirements. US government requirements. If you actually look at the evidence, the United States government actually requires its own pharmaceuticals, such as APIs, to be manufactured within the United States. According to review, okay, this is really hard to pronounce. Okay, we'll go with that. And Shine Jacob, February 7, 2016. As news came in that the US government has made it mandatory for active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, to be manufactured locally for government procurement, the Pharmaceutical Promotion Council of India allayed fears on Friday, saying that their Indian manufacturers should not manufacture. So it's talking about how the United States government actually already requires its own pharmaceuticals to be manufactured in the United States. So that eliminates some of the harm that they were talking about there. And their second point was that of the Chinese manufacturing sector. My one response to this is no evidence of imports. No evidence of imports. Now, all that this evidence proved was that China has a large manufacturing sector for manufacturing APIs, but they haven't actually proven how many of those are getting into the United States and how many people it's actually harmed. So the impact is that there's really no harm here. They haven't proven a harm here from this particular background. Let's go ahead now and take a look at their advantages. Their first advantage was that lives would be saved, and they talked about dangerous chemical products. My first response to this first point is of, quote, risk. That is that there was a risk from chemical products coming from China. They didn't actually link this particular risk to any deaths, to any people being harmed in the United States. My second response to this is of no quantification. They haven't provided a quantification of the supposed risk from APIs from China. They haven't proven that there's actually a need for their case in the current system. Their B point was about how it jumpstarts production. My first response to this is that this was actually talking about a Sudanese problem. Now, this evidence specifically referenced a problem in Sudan, which is obviously not a problem of the United States itself. It wasn't talking about how the United States will jumpstart production. It was talking about a problem in Sudan. Impact, the evidence is irrelevant. This subpoint should be dropped on the ground. Their C point was that there would be safer American medicine. My one response to this is 2006 to 2010. 2006 to 2010. This evidence was specifically referencing a study done from 2006 to 2010. And as I pointed out before, the United States has implemented recent bans
on Chinese APIs. So what we can see in the current system is this study really has no weight in today's debate round. There are new regulations on the book. They have no recent studies that Chinese APIs are actually harming United States citizens. Their second advantage was of increased economic competitiveness. And I think there's a little bit of confusion in the evidence here. So I want to go ahead and respond to their specific subpoints individually. Their A point was of disastrous policy. My one response to this is not about China. Not about China. Now, this evidence that they read under this point was not even referencing China. It was not specific to what we're talking about in today's debate round. It should be, again, discarded from today's debate round because it didn't even reference the country that we're talking about when we're talking about decreasing API imports. Their B point was that the quality would be ensured. My one response to this is that this is not what the evidence said. Not what the evidence said. What the evidence actually said is that China does not monitor its imports of these APIs that are exported to the United States, but it didn't say anything about banning them or how that would actually increase quality in the United States. This point is not proven in today's debate. And their C point was long-term US viability, but my first response is of no quantification. They haven't proven any quantification of how much this would actually help the United States, and my second response to this is no evidence of viability. No evidence of viability. Again, this evidence didn't actually say what they claimed it said because it didn't talk about how the United States would be viable in the long term. What it actually said was that China's companies, when their products are banned from the United States, are actually able to bounce back rather easily. That's all that the evidence said. It didn't say that the United States would be viable by banning these particular products from China. So again, the impact overall to this is that the advantage is not proven. We have no idea how much this would help the economy, or even if it would help the economy at all, because that's not what their evidence was specific to. Now I want to bring up one solvency point that actually undermines the affirmative team's case. And this you can tag as drug imports will not stop. Will not stop. And the fact of the matter is that the affirmative team is only banning these APIs coming from China. All that China has to do to still import these drugs to the United States is to send them to another country like Cambodia or a country around China who can then import it to the United States. That's all that they have to do to get around this ban. We can see specific evidence of this according to John W. Miller, May 25th, 2012. Excuse me. Cambodia suddenly started exporting hundreds of tons of garlic to the European Union a few years ago. Earlier this month, investigators wrapped up a lengthy probe based on this hunt. The garlic turned out to be Chinese, rooted through Cambodia to hide its origin and avoid high EU tariffs and strict quotas. Rerouting goods to avoid tariffs isn't new or unique to Chinese exporters. But in recent years, the US and EU have imposed increasing numbers of quotas and punitive tariffs to combat alleged Chinese dumping, as well as some bans for safety reasons. That appears to be fueling experts to go around these rules. EU officials, for instance, say that they have detected evidence of transshipment for 90% of the 91 products subject to the bloc's anti-dumping tariffs. So all that China has to do to avoid this ban and still get these supposedly harmful drugs into the United States is ship it to another country who then ships it to the United States, and there's no solvency for their case. For these reasons, I would urge a negative ballot.
All of the judges are in? First off, how are you today?
I'm doing very well.
Great. All right, now you mentioned right off the bat your burden of proof talking about 44 companies were banned. And if you would specifically refute our evidence in our 1AC talking about there were over 1,500 companies.
I was talking about specifically the fact that in the current system there are new regulations of these products, and you haven't proven that the ones that are being imported are actually harm to the United States.
Okay, could I see these evidence about the 44 banned?
Yes, absolutely. That is
okay. And now you talked about under your response to my background point of lacks chemical regulations. Now you said specifically that the U.S. government just put in requirements basically not allowing APIs, right?
yes, like the United States has banned several companies that import APIs to the United States.
Okay, now where was that evidence from?
That's what I just did.
It was also on the page?
That was the United States government. Okay, yeah, that was also on that same page, talking about how the United States government requires its APIs to be manufactured in the United States.
And what was the original source on that?
Not sure. You have these.
Okay. Now let's look down to advantage one. Now you talked about response to my dangerous chemical products. You said it was just no risk. So is it your contention that it's fine to allow him basically drugs from a gray zone? We have no idea where they come from?
Okay, your evidence, you haven't actually fulfilled your burden of proof to prove that there's actually harm to United States citizens. If your evidence is just talking about a risk and it doesn't quantify that risk, you haven't shown us that there's actually a need to pass your policy. Furthermore, as I pointed out, that policy wouldn't even work.
Okay, now did you refute the warrant specifically on that evidence saying how it was the president of the American Pharmaceutical Industry or Pharmaceutical Society?
I didn't respond specifically to the source, but the evidence that you brought up is very inconclusive about the actual data of these problems.
Okay, now you mentioned in response to solvency to that of U.S. jumpstarts protection. You said that Sudan, so it doesn't matter. That was essentially your argument.
That's what the evidence was referencing.
Okay, as you respond to the part of the evidence that warrants above that line talking about Sudan, saying how the U.S. takes these measures, it will jumpstart protection and jumpstart international conversation about drug supply as a whole.
I'm not entirely sure which part of the piece of evidence that you're referring to, but it was talking about how the problem, it was talking about a problem that exists in Sudan, not the United States.
Okay, now in response to, I believe it was your solvency point, talking about how drug imports won't stop.
Yes.
You read specifically, it was from 2007, can I just say that?
Yes, absolutely. That's right.
Perfect. Okay, and then last off, in response to Advantage 2, you were talking about how the economic devastation, it wasn't talking about China. So is your contention that that company referencing the evidence wasn't from China?
Again, the evidence wasn't talking about how the United States economy would be harmed because of this policy. It was talking about specifically companies in China.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Starting affirmative protest.
I'm actually okay. Thank you. All right, are all the judges ready? I tried to make a chemistry joke in this speech, but all the good ones are gone, because argon is an element in the periodic table. Alright, so I'd like to respond to philosophy first of all. Now, philosophy was that if we have to show, they're going to essentially say that it's unnecessary, ineffective, and disadvantageous. My response to this is their burden that they must prove. They can't essentially make some sort of claims and expect us to counter every hypothetical. Since they're the negative team, this is evidence shared based creed, they must prove their claims as well, essentially the same standard, they have to back up their assertions. Now they moved straight into the burden of evidence. They said that we need to show the harm now. My first response to the subpoint A was of 44 companies. My response to that is a pharmaceutical. That evidence was specifically talking about pharmaceutical companies that have been banned, which is why the FDA has such stringent regulations on the pharmaceutical industries in China in the first place. That is a term of pharmaceutical protection, because it's actually showing how the pharmaceutical industry are protected in the status quo because the FDA is banning their faulty APIs that could be coming in. It's the chemical ones that they didn't talk about because the chemical ones aren't being monitored, which is why there's such a problem. My second response is of 1,250 not regulated. 1,250 not regulated. They didn't refute our evidence, which specifically stated in the background point 2, how there are 1,500 API manufacturers and only 250 of them are registered. That means that there's 1,250 of them which are not registered and are not regulated. And China has specifically stated that they don't have the jurisdiction to regulate the Chinese chemical companies because they don't fall under the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector. Essentially, these chemical companies are doing it as sort of a legal loophole, as we've already stated. Then they said that we need to show harm now. So my first response to that specific argument is of fentanyl. Fentanyl. Now, David Armstrong, writing for Stat News on April 5th, 2016, stated, Chinese suppliers are providing both raw fentanyl and the machinery necessary for the assembly line production of the drug powering a terrifying and rapid rise of fatal overdoses across the United States, according to drug investigators in court documents. That specific report came from April 2016. That is a current study. And if that's not enough, my next response is a backup. Stanton, writing for Informa Technologies on December 14th of 2015, stated certain lots of background active pharmaceutical ingredient manufactured by Taizu from its facility in Beijing, China, could be at risk for contamination with particulates. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration said, baclofen is used as a central nervous system depressant, and the firm supplied a number of U.S. compounding facilities which were recommended not to use the API after Taizu confirmed that due to the level of controls in the manufacturing process, the the baclofen API it manufactures is not suitable for use in injectable drugs, the agency said. The affected API may potentially pose serious safety risks for U.S. patients who use or receive injectable drug products compounded with the affected baclofen, especially when administered directly into the spinal column. Because baclofen is used as a central nervous system depressant, which is used in surgeries when it's administered to a spinal column, showing how serious this problem specifically is. And I provided 2 current examples from December of last year and April of this year, showing that this still is a current problem. Then they said that these are the Chinese regulations in response to our specific harms that they were spread too thin. My response to this is of FDA spread thin. The FDA is spread way too thin to actually be regulating the Chinese chemical companies. Now, Dr. Roger Bate and Lorraine Moody wrote in from the American Enterprise Institute in 2011, the US FDA has established an office in China and is increasing its investigations of plants that export to the United States. But at best, it can only assess each site once every 13 years. That is a massive amount of time in between, and US pharmaceutical companies are required to be audited and regulated at a minimum of 2 years. Let's compare 2 to 13 years, showing that there's still a massive amount of leeway where we're not regulating these chemical companies. And they also said that the US government requirements, essentially that they have banned these APIs. My response to this is of API ban false. API ban false. Now their evidence was specifically talking about India and how India would be redirected. This is from The Hindu, which is an Indian newspaper which originally broke that article. And it states on February 7, 2016, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration said FDA requirements that govern the approval of drugs for marketing in the U.S. have not changed. Christopher C. Kelly, press officer from the Office of Media Affairs for the U.S. FDA, said in a report published by The Hindu, stating that the U.S. government had made it mandatory for the APIs to be manufactured locally in the context of government procurement was, quote, false. So that quote that they originally read was later recanted by the FDA media officer, who specifically said that it was no longer happening. So that specific point was not applied. Then they said that we have no evidence of imports. My response to this is a plan. If you specifically look at all of the effects that we've been talking about, it's been talking about how we're getting these drugs from China. And if you look at the heparin scandal, baclofen, and fentanyl, all of those came from imports. That is evidence of imports. And they said risk, in quotation, and no quantification. My response to this is of 246 deaths. They didn't let my partner quantify the question that they asked him, but heparin actually resulted in 246 deaths. And we haven't seen the total number from baclofen and fentanyl because they were so recent. So we can't see from the incident in 2007 and 2008 that we previously stated that there was a quantifiable loss of life due to a Chinese chemical company known as Scientific Protein Laboratories. There is a clear link to this argument. And they also said that we're talking about Sudanese. My first response is of U.S. action. Our evidence specifically said that the U.S. participating more would generate international conversation and international action, which could help to prevent the Sudanese children from dying and not being injected with the correct meningitis vaccines. My second response is still important. They gave no warrant as to why we should not be caring about Sudanese children who are dying any more than people in the United States. That is still important to us, and we are the only team that actually provides this international conversation by enacting our plan. Then they said 2006 and 2010. My responses are baclofen and fentanyl. We provided specific examples showing how this is still ongoing and this is still a significant problem. They said that it's not about China in response to our form of economic devastation. My response is from SPL. When we specifically talked about the heparin incident, it came from Scientific Protein Laboratories, which is a chemical company in China that the heparin scandal was traced back to. That's the link, that's what it was specifically talking about when we said that they had a lawsuit of $625,000. Then they said that it's not what the evidence said in response to our solvency of the quality of products insured. My response is to block prevents. What that evidence is talking about is China is unable to actually be regulating their industries, which is why essentially we say we can't be allowing this to continue and we need to be blocking them off. That's the only way that we can actually do this, because China and the US are capable of regulating the chemical industries. They said there was no quantification. My response to this is of $625,000 per lawsuit. We gave a specific amount in one lawsuit, and the evidence also said that there were hundreds more. That is quantification. And if you look back up at our first advantage, it talked about how there was stockouts as a result of every single one that had slightly inferior quality. And then they said that it's no viability. My response is of recalls and faster. We already saw this. And then they said that the drugs imports would not stop. My response to this is of audits checked back. Audits check back. The U.S. pharmaceutical companies are required to have audits, which check back and ensure that they have to have their products coming from the specific site. And second response is other countries. Other countries have regulations. It's only in China that we have this loophole. That's why I would urge you to pass this bill. Thank you.
All right, let's start out into the argument about the burden. And you said that this was specifically referencing pharmaceutical imports. You would agree that the evidence was specifically talking about APIs imported from China?
Absolutely not. Your evidence did not even say APIs.
Interesting. Could I actually see that piece of evidence?
Absolutely. I think my partner has it right.
Okay, we can get that. And then you're also talking about how 12,000, actually, let's go ahead and move down to your example of it.
Okay.
So you're saying that this was specifically linked to deaths in the United States?
Yes.
Okay, have those imports of fentanyl been blocked by the United States government, or are they still being?
They have not been blocked yet, as this was April 2016 that it was reported. It was extremely recent.
Interesting. And that piece of evidence specifically said that those imports were from China?
Yes, it said Chinese suppliers are providing both raw fentanyl and the machinery necessary.
Could I see that piece of evidence?
Absolutely, take care.
And then we're talking about how the FDA, and then you also brought up the example of faculty.
Yes.
Could I actually see the piece of evidence that you read?
Certainly, take care.
And you said that the FDA is spread too thin. Okay, and was this specific to regulation of APIs, or was this just the FDA in general?
It was the FDA in general, because the FDA is trying to look at those APIs because they are the Chinese
Okay,
government.
so we don't know how much the FDA actually regulates APIs in the current system.
If the FDA is regulating the entire country once every 13 years, they're not regulating the chemical industries any more than that.
Interesting. And then you were talking, actually, could I say that piece of evidence?
Second one, right here.
And then you were talking about how the evidence was about China. Actually, let's go ahead and move down to your point, about 246 deaths.
Yes.
And did you read evidence under this point?
No, I was specifically referencing what you asked my partner, and then you didn't allow him to finish when you asked for the quantification. You can provide evidence if you would like to see it.
Okay, so you haven't read that evidence.
I haven't read the evidence in the round, but I also can quantify this. And our evidence already said 81 deaths when it referenced heparin in our one.
Interesting. And which piece of evidence was that referenced 81?
For American medicine.
Okay, and that study was from 2006 to 2010.
Yes, it was, but it still referenced deaths, which is what you were asking.
Okay, and the 246 deaths, that was from heparin, the drug specifically, right?
Yes, it was.
Okay, and is that in pharmaceutical drugs, or is that?
Heparin is an active pharmaceutical ingredient that is later used in a drug as a blood thinner.
Okay, so did those drugs come from pharmaceutical companies in China, or from the chemical producers themselves?
They came from Scientific Protein Laboratories, which is a chemical company in China. It did not come through a pharmaceutical company in China.
Interesting. And you have brought up evidence to support that?
I didn't read evidence. You can also see it if you would like.
Talking about how it would stimulate international action.
Yes.
Okay, so your claim is basically that if the United States acts, then other countries will act as well.
That's not our claim. That's what our evidence specifically said would happen.
Interesting. And then you're also talking about how the audits check back under the solvency argument.
Yes.
Okay, so you would agree that if China imports something to Cambodia and Cambodia imports it to the United States, audits would check back to Cambodia as importing it to the United States.
Yes, the U.S. pharmaceuticals have to look into the origin, and then the second response is that all countries have regulations.
Thank you. If we're all ready. Yeah.
Okay. Now, unlike Ms. Hampton, I am not going to tell a chemistry joke. Why? I wouldn't get a reaction. With that being said, let's take a look at a couple off-case arguments. Now, Ryan's going to be responding to the majority of the citizen's speech, and we're going to be looking at why, even if you agree with every single thing that my esteemed colleagues have said, you ought to vote against them, because their plan, although it has good intentions, will result in the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent Africans as well as people within the United States. So let's take a look at a couple of solvency points that they cannot solve the problem with their mandate. The first solvency point you can label as China will relabel. China will relabel. This is from Melanie and Ben Hirschler on August 28, 2012. In China, there are few legal repercussions for broker firms who relabel or misrepresent products, and tracing counterfeit and substandard APIs is extremely difficult. There are a lot of brokers who are relabeling APIs, which means you cannot trace where the API is coming from, and that adds to the risk. They cannot determine the source of the APIs due to relabeling. What does this mean? This means that Chinese companies can relabel the API and say that it comes from Australia, it comes from New Zealand, it comes from Kathmandu, wherever they want, and ultimately we can't stop it because we can only ban the imports from China, and that's only determined by the label on the package. And that leads to the impact of no solvency. They cannot achieve solvency with their plan because the Chinese companies, obviously, if they see that there's a ban on Chinese imported APIs, they'll just say, hey, let's relabel it to some different country. That leads me to my second solvency point, and that is China will smuggle. China will smuggle. Subpoint A under this argument is that it's a lucrative business. Okay, smuggling drugs, not only smuggling drugs, but API and people getting API companies within the United States receiving those from Chinese importers. It's a very lucrative business. They don't have to pay as much because they're counterfeit drugs. Okay, that means subpoint B, China already smuggles. This to give you some background. This is from Joshua Phillip on January 26, 2016. For example, there are more than 150 publicly listed Chinese chemical companies selling the drug alpha PDP, also known as Flakka, according to the New York Times. Flakka is replacing cocaine use in Florida and has been the cause of at least 18 deaths. As for methamphetamine, that's a chemistry word. Okay, according to this chemical, a 2012 national survey found there's an estimated 1.2 billion users in the United States. These drugs and many others like them have a critical feature in common. They, or otherwise controlled chemicals used to make them, originate in China, and for years Chinese regulators have shown little interest in helping stem the flow. What does that mean? It means that China already smuggles or makes illicit drugs. So that leads to subpoint C of this argument, and as if APIs will just become illicit. APIs will simply become illicit, they'll go underground, and they'll still sell in the United States to the people who specifically don't want to buy from a regulated, ultimately verifiable source, and that's what the people are doing. With regards to the heparin incident they keep citing, that was because a company within the United States didn't want to pay as much for a regulated, verifiable, US FDA approved source, and instead they went for the cheaper option. So this economic harm isn't on the United States, it's on a company who violated the rules. Okay, that leads me to my impact, and that is no solvency. That leads me to my third solvency argument, and that is no funding. Okay, they provided no funding in their plan, within their mandates, they said no funding is necessary. They're actually wrong. This is from Fairfax in 2016. Quote, the budget is the primary way that federal, state, and local governments direct their policies and priorities. Directly or indirectly, all policy at all levels of government involves funding. What does this mean? Funding is required for all policies at all levels of government. That is the impact. This is an unworkable plan. It's obviously required, and since they don't do that, this is an unworkable plan. You can pass it, there's ultimately no money to enforce it, et cetera, et cetera. So that leads me to the disadvantages, and these disadvantages are conditional to the solvency points I talked about earlier. So they can't solve the problem, but even if they could, all of these disadvantages apply. The first disadvantage is a drug supply crisis. A drug supply crisis. You can tackle the background point number one as 40% of US API. US API. Clarifying this in a cross-examination question, Justin said that 40% of the United States API comes from China. That leads to the background point number two, that our domestic manufacturing is inadequate. So 40% of our API comes from China, but the problem is that domestic manufacturing is inadequate to take over 40% of the supply chain. This is coming from CNBC, quoting Karan Mazumdar-Shaw on February 5th, 2016. However, even if you were to consider such a point being discussed and mandated by the United States government, is simply not possible. You must understand that today 80% of APIs are imported from India and China. Believe me, you cannot overnight switch to local manufacturing because it takes at least 3 to 4 years before you can even set up and qualify a plant, and then another year or so to actually get it approved. There's no way people are going to invest that kind of capital in setting up API plants just because the government one fine day for some reason decides that APIs have to be manufactured locally. The thing is, it takes 3 to 4 years to actually manufacture APIs locally. That leads to the link, the 3-month timeline. They said their mandate will be enacted. They're banning imports from China, those APIs from chemical companies, in 3 months. It takes about 3 to 4 years to actually establish a local manufacturing base. They can't claim they'll just come through drug companies because ultimately the United States imports API. They don't import the drugs, they import the API, not from pharmaceutical companies, from the chemical companies. So that leads to the impact of the internal link, and that's 40% of the critical supply is lost. Supply is lost as a result of them one fine day saying, hey, we think it's important to require we locally manufacture 40% of our APIs. That leads to the impact of people die. People will die as a result of our drug supply not being there, 40% of it completely dissolving after 3 months. That leads me to the second disadvantage. And this totally outweighs their advantages because that leads to you can tag it as the deaths of Africans. The deaths of Africans. This is from, you tag the first background point is that African regulations are lower. African regulations are lower. Ultimately, African regulations are not as stringent as the United States government, and this is from Melanie Lee and Ben Hirschler on August 28, 2012. In places like Africa, where there are a lot of local medicine manufacturers who all use APIs from China, the export of unregulated drug ingredients may be putting lives at risk, particularly in poor countries where local pharmaceutical controls are minimal. That leads to uniqueness points. 2, companies won't stop producing. Or the background point. The companies won't stop producing. Just because they're banning the import from those Chinese companies doesn't mean they'll just automatically stop producing. Why? Because it's a lucrative business. That leads to the background point number 3, and this is obvious, that African lives are just as valuable as United States lives. There's no difference just because we live. That leads to the link. They'll just redirect supply. The Chinese companies will just redirect supply because it's a lucrative business. The regulations for Africa are already lower. That leads to the impact of the thousands of Africans dying. All of the evidence of the affirmative team points out how dangerous fake APIs are. Those will all just go to Africa. If the affirmative team wants to make the claim United States lives are more important than African lives, they can make it, but I would urge you to stand with the negative team and negate the affirmative team's one. Thanks.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm great, thank you for asking. All right, now first of all, just to clarify, in my speech, didn't I make a statement that I believe that Sudanese citizens are just as important as US citizens?
Sure.
Okay, perfect, just so that we're all on the same page there. Now, did China recently implement a requirement of barcodes on all of the pharmaceutical products that they export?
You guys said they don't have very many chemical regulations, and you didn't bring up any evidence to prove that point, so I can
Okay, and so that's talking about pharmaceutical companies that have the barcodes, correct?
You present no evidence, so I can't confirm or deny that.
All right, now is FLACA already illegal?
FLACA is illegal, yes, it's a legal substance.
Okay, so now would we be doing anything to alter FLACA with our plan?
No, that was the background point talking about how FLACA is already illegal. So the drugs or the fake APIs will just become illicit drugs and be transported to the United States anyways.
Okay, so now are APIs actual drugs, or do they require processing before they can become a drug?
Processing before they can become a drug. But that was just a specific example analyzing that illicit substances are already produced in China and then exported to the United States. And the reason why all these
All right, so then your contention is that we would be importing these illicit substances now to the US pharmaceutical companies who would make them into illegal drugs?
No, the thing is that what my point under that was because of the people you cited, such as the heparin incident, they already knew these were unregulated, unverifiable sources. So the thing is, this wouldn't change, it just become illegal drugs, and the export to the United States would remain the same.
So now, wouldn't audits detect if a smuggled product came into the United States?
No, not necessarily.
Okay, so it wouldn't show up on the paper trail, you're saying that the US pharmaceutical companies would just wipe it clean?
Sure, I don't see why they couldn't do that.
All right, you don't see why the US pharmaceutical companies wouldn't break the law?
The heparin incident proves that pharmaceutical companies are willing to break the law. They're willing to go to that low extreme and buy stuff that's ultimately cheaper, but endangers American people's lives.
Now, did the heparin incident occur because companies broke the law or because they weren't able to detect that it was a subpar ingredient?
It doesn't matter because ultimately they can just relabel the substance anyway. Say it comes from Australia, and even though it's a subpar API, it can't be determined as such because it says you can't ban the importation of those goods.
All right, well, if they're unwilling to lie, then wouldn't it show that your specific argumentation wouldn't come about?
No, the thing is that goes back to my point. Under the heparin incident, it was as a result of an unverified, unaccountable source that was ultimately not proved by the FDA to be alright to use.
Okay, and now, can we still obtain APIs from China with our plan just through pharmaceutical industries?
No, the pharmaceutical industries ultimately refine the drug and make it into refine the product and make it into a drug. So they're not the ones exporting APIs.
All right, now do pharmaceutical companies manufacture APIs as well?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you, no further questions.
Starting getting contact. 1 minute and 30 seconds. One minute remaining.
So in this speech, I want to go back to the last affirmative speech and take a look at some of the responses that were made in my speech and show you why you should ultimately vote with the negative team. So let's go ahead and get right into the argumentation. The first thing that was brought up in the last speech about my argument of the burden of showing the harm now is that this was talking about pharmaceutical imports. My first response to this is of manufacturers. This piece of evidence was specifically talking about the manufacturers and their imports into the United States and how those imports, many of those imports have already been banned in the United States right now. So I believe that that's still relevant in today's debate. They also talk about how 1,250 are not regulated, but my one response to this is that they have to prove that this is a problem. They have to prove that specifically these imports, and I'll be showing you why this isn't the case in a moment, they have to show why these imports are actually harming or are the ones harming United States citizens. So let's go ahead and move down to their examples. They brought up two examples of fentanyl and baclofen, and they brought up one other example in their 1AC. I forget what the drug is called, but it was one other drug that they referenced that causes death in the United States. I want to go through each of these examples and show you why they don't actually prove that there's a harm to the United States. The first example was of fentanyl. My first response to this is problem from illegal sale. Problem from illegal sale. If you actually read the piece of evidence that the affirmative team presented in the last speech, it says that the problem is from the illegal sale of these products in the United States. It's a piece of the part of the evidence that they did create. It's at the top of the paragraph. It talks about how the problem is from the illegal sale, not the legal import of these chemicals into the United States. This is why this piece of evidence or this particular drug should be disregarded in the United States. They're not stopping the illegal sale of this drug in the United States. My second response to this is of overdoses. The evidence specifically said that the problem is from overdoses of this drug. The problem itself is not the drug, it's the overdose of that drug to United States citizens. The impact is that it is irrelevant. You should disregard the example of this drug in today's debate. Their second example was of baclofen. My first response to this is not linked to death. Not linked to death. Again, all that this evidence said was that there was a risk from this particular drug. It did not bring any conclusions about harms to United States citizens. My second response to this is not from China. It wasn't specific. I don't believe that it was specifically referencing China in this piece of evidence. As I pointed out earlier, 44 companies have been banned, their products have been banned from entering the United States. The affirmative team hasn't actually proven that these drugs are still entering the United States if they're supposedly so bad for the United States citizens. Again, they have to prove that these particular drugs, fentanyl, baclofen, and again, I can't remember the other drug that they referenced, are actually entering the United States right now and are still a relevant problem that we need to address. They also talked about how the FDA is spread too thin, but this argument actually doesn't stand in today's debate. My first response to this is that Chinese regulations are the problem. All of their evidence has actually been talking about how the problem is actually Chinese regulations, not United States regulations. The point I was making under this is when things and drugs are imported into the United States, they are regulated by the United States government. My second response to this is of the FDA in China. FDA in China. If you actually read that piece of evidence, it was talking about how the FDA can't actually effectively regulate within China or the imports that are coming in from China. It wasn't talking about the FDA in the United States and how the FDA actually regulates what comes into the United States. So again, the evidence there is irrelevant. And my third response to this is that it's not specific to APIs. Not specific to APIs. So they haven't proven how the FDA is not doing a good job of stopping this in the current system. They have not proven up harmful reasons for change. They also talked about how the API ban was also, actually let's go ahead and move down to the next argument. They're talking about 46 deaths. The response to this is of no evidence. They didn't actually present this evidence in the last speech. I would urge you not to consider this number in your decision because they haven't actually verified this claim with any evidence. If evidence isn't presented in the round, it should be disregarded. That number, you can't take that number because they didn't actually read the evidence in today's debate round. My second response to this is no evidence of 81 deaths. No evidence of 81 deaths. I may be mistaken, but I don't believe that they actually presented the evidence of 81 deaths occurring in the United States in the current system. The impact is that there's no evidence of death quantified. They haven't actually quantified how much this is harming the United States citizens. They also talked about how it would stimulate international action, but my one response is no quantification. They didn't quantify or actually present any conclusive evidence about how much it would actually stop this problem around the world. They also talked about baclofen and fentanyl under their next point, but again, I've already responded to these, shown that they were irrelevant. They also talked about how the problem was from this particular company, SPL, but my one response to this is that the problem was with the company. Now, their argument under this point doesn't really stand because the problem was actually with how the company was administering the drug, not from the drug itself. So the impact is, again, that this example is irrelevant. Then they also talked about how the audits checked that. My first response to this is of no evidence. They didn't bring up any evidence that this solvency point would not occur. And my second response is it already happens. My whole point about how China can reroute these drugs to another company and then export it to the United States is very important because they already get around the United States regulations that will not change if you ban these products in the current system. For all these reasons, I would ask you to vote with the negative team.
Starting from the left. Seconds, please. One minute used. One minute and 30 seconds used. minutes remaining. Two minutes and 30 seconds. Two minutes remaining.
Is all the judges ready? Now, it seems like the affirmative case has been a pretty hard pill to swallow for the negative team. Now, let's specifically at the two and see. It's not the first solvency point of China for the label. I have a couple of responses. My first is term. This is why we ban. We ban all imports of Chinese companies they can't relabel. My second response is a barcodes. Barcodes, specific type of pharmaceuticals that would come from China or have barcodes. I read that in my 1AC. That's what we go to pharmaceutical companies. And my third response is that China is trying to eradicate. China is also trying to eradicate this. It's just different jurisdiction with the chemical companies, as I talked about. So this actually shows where we need to pass our plan. Second solvency point is China will smuggle, basically smuggling into the United States. My response here is we're preventing from U.S. pharmaceuticals. We're preventing from U.S. pharmaceuticals. The point of our plan is to ban Chinese chemicals from getting into legitimate U.S. pharmaceuticals and killing people because we also label Pfizer and think, oh, this is safe. That's what we're solving. My second response is it's already illegal. The fact that it's already illegal. We're not trying to change that. That's already illegal. It's already banned. What we are solving it is to make legitimate U.S. drugs and killing them because they're prescribed by doctors and then people die. That is our harming claim. The third solvency point was they said no funding. My response here is already auditing. This is noted by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in November 2014. This is at a minimum. It's a minimum. Each pharmaceutical quality control laboratory should receive a comprehensive GMP evaluation each 2 years as part of the statutory inspection obligation. So what does this mean? They're already being audited. We're not increasing regulations. They're already being audited every 2 years. In response to disadvantage one of drug supply crisis, my response to this third link was hinging upon the fact that 40% come from China. So my response to this link was that a legitimate pharmaceutical remains. Now, Pew Charitable Trust noted in July of 2011 that important action for manufacturers to take, according to the FDA, is to insist that pharmaceutical ingredient suppliers in China are licensed pharmaceutical manufacturers rather than chemical companies. Again, pharmaceutical companies can make APIs. The impact here is it makes it safer. The pharmaceutical companies already manufacture APIs, it makes it safer. In response to the second disadvantage of death of applicants, my response is a term, U.S. Jumpstart Protection. They didn't respond to the warrants in our 1AC specifically saying that our course of action would jumpstart protection, not just for U.S. citizens, but also for border countries. That I never responded to. My second response is both are dying now. Both are dying right now in status quo. If they read evidence and we read evidence, we start that protection. We're the only team that begins to make reform. The negative use it as it is. Then in response to looking down to the 1NR, they said in response to our pharmaceutical companies, about 44 companies advanced manufacturers, and we must prove the problem. My response is unregulated. We proved in our 1AC these companies are completely unregulated. We should have unregulated companies sending us products that kill people and put them in our supply chain. Overall fentanyl example is this is a problem from illegal sale and overdoses. My response is the raw ingredient. If you actually look at the evidence talking about fentanyl, it specifically says it's the raw ingredient. It's only illegal when it's manufactured into the completed drug. They're importing the raw ingredient, and that's what we're banning. Then in response to backup, and it said it's not linked to death and not from China. My My response is from China and dangerous. From China and dangerous. Looking specifically at our evidence talking about baclofen, it specifically said in that evidence it comes from China. They said it didn't, but it's in the evidence, and you have the ability to review that background or strong encouraging to do so. Then in response to our background point of lax chemical regulations, they said China regulatory problems, it's a Chinese regulatory problem. The FDA in China and not specific APIs. Two responses. First, once every 13 years. Once every 13 years. They completely dropped that analysis in Department Red, saying they can only inspect 1 every 13 years, which means all those chemical companies we're getting from are completely unregulated for the rest of those 12 years. The next response is that of baclofen and heparin. Baclofen and heparin shows exactly that the FDA, because they can inspect these facilities, we get heparin and baclofen as well as fentanyl in the United States, which kills people. That analysis is not reviewed. Then in response to my partner's 246 quantification, they said there was no evidence of this and no evidence of the H1 deaths. So my response is that evidence. Now, Bloomberg News noted on March 2016 that since 2007, around the time of the scope of the chemically enhanced crude heparin, the chemical oversulfated butyric sulfate was connected to 246 deaths. There was the evidence they wanted to read, and the 81 number was in our 1AC under our arm. They didn't address that. Then in response to my partner's arguments of U.S. action is still important, they said we didn't actually say this. For us to apply my argument of turn and jumpstarts protection. We start protecting the world. Then in response to Advantage 2, they talked about problem companies about the SPL. My response is purposeful substitute. Our evidence went undefeated at the round saying this is a purposeful substitute on behalf of the Chinese company. We're going to import because we don't want them to do that. And finally, they said it's not important about the audits. Cross-employment evidence that the audits take place every 2 years. We don't need more funding, not a beneficial scale if we just decide with the affirmative team. Thank you for your time.
Starting at the top. 30 seconds, please. Time's up.
Now, why are Joe such bad joke tellers? Well, the jokes, they vary. Okay, that was the worst. Okay, I just didn't proceed. Okay, let's take a look at the first argument talking about solvency with regards to China. We'll just relay the drug as it's coming from a different. He said this is why we banned their barcodes in China's eradicate. I have two responses to this. My first is that the ban won't help. The ban won't help. Their specific ban was on imports of APIs from chemical companies in China. That means they relabel it as a chemical company, not in China, and it can still come into the United States. That leads me to my second response, and this is specific to his barcode point. He read no evidence under that, nor did he cite specific evidence within the 1AC. He just referred to, I read that in my 1AC, but he didn't actually give us the evidence. So that leads to the impact. Relabeling will occur. Relabeling will occur, and because it will occur, there is no solvency to the affirmative team's plan. Under China will smuggle. He said we're preventing from U.S. pharmacies, and FLACA is already illegal. I have one response here, and that is if APIs will become illicit, or counterfeit APIs will become illicit. He disregarded my argument talking about how it was a lucrative business, and ultimately the people who they were quoting, the heparin agencies, they already knew it was a bad drug. It was a bad source of drug. It wasn't approved by the FDA. They already knew that. They imported it anyway. That economic cost fell on them because they didn't abide by the rules put in place. So that leads me to the impact of China will smuggle. China will just smuggle the drugs to the companies who have already bought from them in the past because it was just a lower price. That leads to the impact of there's no point to voting affirmative. Ultimately, you won't do anything. So if you want to do something, just give the negative team a win because the affirmative team's plan will not actually do anything. Let's take a look at his next argument with regard to the third solvency point under no funding. He said this is already audited. I have one response here, and this is not refutation. Okay, saying something is audited is not refutation to the fact that their plan, their mandate must be enforced, and that enforcement must require funding. He disregarded my piece of evidence, which you're welcome to see, and said all policy at all levels of government directly or indirectly involve funding. The thing is, this is paramount. They have no funding, that leads to be impacted by unworkable. You can't vote for an unworkable plan when you can get the negative team to win instead and prevent the disadvantage of hundreds or thousands, just multiply the impact of fake APIs and apply that to the people in Africa. Let's take a look at how the U.S. jumpstarts action with regards to the disadvantage of drugs of the second disadvantage, that deaths of Africans. And I have one response here, and that's no qualification. He dropped Ryan's analysis talking about how there was no qualification to how much the problem would be stopped as a result of the United States jumpstarting action. So he didn't provide that. That is not an accurate refutation or an adequate refutation to the disadvantage. The disadvantage outweighs all of the affirmative team's arguments because they're saying, ultimately, and this is the reason why, because African regulations are much lower than the United States regulations. So they're just going to redirect supply and be able to import more illicit drugs, more illicit APIs, ultimately not solving the problem. And then under the argument talking about how they were banning raw ingredients with regards to the specific drug of baclofen. And my one response here is that no evidence. They didn't actually specifically cite a piece of evidence that said they were only, the raw ingredient was the problem within this drug. It was actually the drug that was the problem, not just the raw ingredient. That leads me to the next point, talking about once in 13 years. And this argument was specific to the argument talking about how Chinese regulations are the problem, and this was ultimately not specific to the API with regards to the last chemical regulations. And I have one response here, and that is in China, not imports. It's talking about the auditing of companies in China by a Chinese Food and Drug Administration, not the imports that are audited by the Federal Drug Administration of the United States. So let's take a look at this next argument, talking about the evidence with regards to the quantification of lives lost. Now, I have one response here, and he read a piece of evidence talking about the 46 deaths, and I have one response here, and it's not specific to China. It was not specific to China, and therefore the impact of their only quantification is not even specific. And this leads to one of the most important arguments in today's debate on the solvency point, talking about how drugs will just reroute and ultimately get into the United States. They said this audits will correct. They give no warrant under this whatsoever. And the fact of the matter is 90% of the 91 banned products in the United States coming from China, they already get in. 90% of the 91 products that are banned already get into the United States. If you vote for the affirmative team, it will do nothing. The drugs will go to Cambodia before they come here, go to Vietnam before they come here. So for the voting issues of solvency and disadvantages, you need to vote for the negative team. Thanks.
Starting at your next question.
Here.
Which time do we have left? 2 minutes. And 30 seconds. One minute remaining.
All right, are all of the judges almost ready? Perfect. I apologize for the quality of my joke in my last speech. I've been trying to update them periodically. Okay. Now that I've gotten that through, I want to respond to some of the few lingering concerns that the negative team brought up. Now, the first argument they said was that the ban won't help and that relabeling will occur. And I have one major response to the audits detect. They dropped all the analysis that we had on the audits because what audits specifically do is they require the companies to look into the history of where it was manufactured. They require to look into the testing of the product. These audits will be detecting. That specifically solves for the fact that even if they relabel, it's still going to actually look into the history of where it was manufactured and require actual testing to show that these products are quality. Now they said that they already knew it was a bad thing. And my response to this is that the testing faulty. The testing faulty. Now specifically the US inspections of heparin were faulty. They didn't deliberately lie. Dr. Roger Bate and Lorraine Mooney wrote for the American Enterprise Institute in 2011, imports to the United States are analyzed on receipt, but as is the case with fraudulently contaminated heparin, standard tests miss faulty products and dangerous drugs slip through the cracks. That takes out their entire link to that specific argument, because the companies aren't doing it specifically and maliciously. The only thing is that these are so close to the actual product that they're unable to detect them, as was the case with heparin when they substituted over-sulfated chondroitin sulfate. That's what happened. They weren't able to detect, which is why we need to ban them, because the testing isn't specifically working to detect that they're fraudulent. We need the audits to specifically be showing where they're coming from and to require a testing history. And they said that there's no refutation about our funding. My response to this is that normal means. Normal means. Now they said that in every single instance there's going to be some sort of funding, and my partner specifically talked about how we're not implementing any sort of course of action except for legislation. And with legislation, normal means applies, which ensures that everything happens. This is the standard procedure for passing a piece of legislation. They never showed any source of funding that would occur with our plan. That was a generic piece of evidence saying that essentially whenever you do something that's going to require funding, normal means our plan doesn't require any other course of action, it simply stops something. Then they said that there was no qualification and that there's African regulations. My response is action provided. Action provided. What we were specifically talking about with our solvency point is that the US stepping up its regulations provides a clear analysis to the international community, and the international community will follow. They never refuted the warrants behind this argument that the US taking the first step creates a solution to the international problem. That's how we actually solve for their harms about the African children better than they do, because they provide no other course of action. They advocate for the status quo where we have illegal and we have dangerous drugs coming in API form. And they specifically said that there was no evidence talking about fentanyl. My response is raw fentanyl. Our evidence specifically talked about how illegal drugs are coming in and how fentanyl is illegal, but that the Chinese found a way around it by putting in raw fentanyl and putting in the manufacturing industry. That's how they get around it. We've already been talking about this today. That's essentially their loophole. They put in the raw ingredients, which aren't illegal, and then they get it into our country. It's not in China, therefore our audits aren't important. My response is of the US FDA. Our specific evidence talked about how the US FDA can only regulate the Chinese chemical companies once every 13 years. That was specific, and it's showing that they're not receiving proper attention. And they said that it's not specific to China. My response is a loophole. We were specifically showing a loophole, and then they said that there was audits with no warrants in 90% of 91 products. My response is of no evidence. They didn't read any evidence specifically backing up that claim that they made in their last speech. My second response is of companies regulate. The companies are required to perform these testing products. It's only because we have the Chinese chemical companies, which are unregulated and have incredibly close counterfeits that are so similar that we haven't been able to detect. So I'd like to move into my 3 voting issues today. The first is of assurance. Assurance. Once we ban the import of Chinese chemical companies' APIs, we have assurance that we're getting legitimate products because pharmaceutical industries are highly regulated and undergo strenuous testing, and their products are required to have a barcode which tracks their specific progress. The second voting issue is of production. Production. Now they dropped all the analysis under this, specifically talking about how it causes stockouts right now, which prevents the quality and quantity of medicine from reaching American people, and it specifically even said that it doesn't matter how many people die. The fact that there's an impurity causes stockouts. So even if you still want to look at the quantification in the round, any impurity causes this. The last voting issue is of irreversibility, because we are the only team that can actually prevent the loss of life. On the irreversibility of this, our impacts outweigh. They completely dropped their disadvantage that was specifically talking about how we're going to be putting in a drug supply crisis. So for the acronym that my voting issue spell out, I would urge you to vote to stop the APIs. Thank you.
you so much.